Time for the newspaper review. This is where Mariam and I look at the stories making headlines around the world. We'll begin with the Moscow Times. It's leading with protesters in the eastern Ukraine city of Donetsk announcing a referendum to join Russia. It says that President Putin wants a crackdown on destructive activities by non-governmental organisations.
The US edition of the Financial Times reports Greece is taking advantage of low rates, preparing to launch its first sovereign bond in 4 years.
The UK edition of the FT looks at a radical shake-up of the way the British economy is measured. New global accounting standards will be introduced in September to portray a nation of savers, perhaps.
Barclays has avoided trial over a landmark LIBOR case. The front page of the Daily Telegraph business section claims the bank has agreed a $66 million settlement with Guardian Care Homes.
Front page of The Independent features a report that the Royal Bank of Scotland is advising hundreds of businesses across Britain to draw up zero-hour contracts for their employees.
And the name of Stradivarius may have been synonymous with unmatched musical excellence for 3 centuries. But the Daily Telegraph says in blind tests, not even the top players can tell the difference between the antique violins and the new ones. Interesting.
Rolake Akinkugbe, head of energy research at EcoBank, is with us. Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Let's begin with the Moscow Times, shall we? There has been disruption in East Ukraine throughout the time we've been reporting Crimea, but now this seems a step further, and sanctions that have been offered don't seem to be bothering the Russians at all. And now there are talks of referendum, according to the front page of the Moscow Times.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I think one of the interesting distinctions that needs to be made about Donetsk is that, unlike Crimea, the Donetsk authorities, those who are calling for a referendum and wanting to declare an independent republic, didn't actually have an existing parliament or governing body in the first place. So they still have a lot of hurdles to cross. But what it does show is that Ukraine as a whole is facing a really uncertain future because now it seems it's becoming a bit of a domino effect, and whether the earlier EU stance against Russia has had the impact intended is really now doubtful. We're seeing troops building on the border. NATO is also concerned. So really this is reaching a really critical time for Ukraine.
Considering you cover energy, or it's a big focus of your work, how is this affecting the sector?
Well, I mean, it's still a major issue. There's still a lot of uncertainty. Ukraine has been debating with Gazprom around energy pricing and finalizing contracts. And this is only going to place a great deal more uncertainty on that process. There's also a longer-term question, the EU dependence on Russian energy as well, and how this crisis in Ukraine will impact that and further undermine any long-term prospects of energy security for the continent. Yeah.
Let's look at the Financial Times USA version. Interesting story, this. It looks like Greece is returning to the capital markets, back in business on the one hand, but on the other hand, only last week it received the latest tranche of its money from the EU. So it kind of makes you think, well, OK, it's back in business in one sense, but a lot hasn't really changed, has it?
No, a lot hasn't really changed. And there's a question in my mind of whether Greece should be testing the waters to see how international investors feel, what market sentiment is towards Greece. The danger is here for Greece is not to pay too high a yield on the bonds, because obviously there's a debt burden. And let's not forget, only 2 years ago, there was a default to private lenders. So the real question is it too much, too soon, perhaps? Or really giving that one of the Greek's largest banks also tested the markets, the bond markets, well, is it not such a bad thing? And is this a sign of a broader economic recovery in Greece? I think it's probably too early. But one thing is clear, is that emerging markets are seeing an outflow of funds, which perhaps countries on the periphery in Europe might be benefiting from right now.
You sound quite positive.
Well, it's not that I'm positive. It's quite soon. And Greece compared to Portugal, for instance, some people are a lot more bullish about Portugal's prospects, perhaps, and while the Greek authorities being so sort of bullish about their prospects, I think there's clearly an election around in May, and perhaps there's a need to be shown to speeding up the economic recovery a bit faster. So there could be a bit of a political angle to this as well.
Shall we talk about the Financial Times in the UK or the UK edition? Its lead story is about how there's going to be a radical overhaul of the national accounts in the UK this autumn that's basically going to double an official measure of household savings.
Yeah.
What does this make you think? Because to me, it just means, OK, well, we're using different numbers to paint a completely different picture.
Well, to paint a completely different picture, and one of the most interesting things here, it says that from now on, the official figures will actually count future pension figures as if they were present income. That's a fairly groundbreaking concept. But the other interesting thing is, given the fact that interest rates have been at an all-time low, which has actually disincentivized savings as a whole, it's quite interesting. But it also does have the unintended effect of potentially increasing the debt burden, but it then also counts other sectors perhaps that haven't been taken into account into the total calculation of GDP for the UK.
Why do you think they're doing this now?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities. The real question is not really about GDP. We know, as you know, economists will tell you, the most important really indicator is GDP per capita, which is actually a lot more important than GDP as a whole. But also, it could perhaps to give a psychological boost to the UK economy, and then that's something I don't think we should miss.
The FT has said the reforms will have the potential to both overturn Britain's reputation as a spendthrift nation and significantly improve the poor productivity performance of recent years.
Yeah.
Do we have that reputation? Does the UK have that reputation?
I'm not really sure compared to other parts of Europe, perhaps.
Maybe a nation of debt.
A nation of debt and certainly high borrowers.
And, yeah, because
that's the
we
other
want
thing.
to spend.
Exactly, because we want to spend. But we've not been seen as savers over the last few years because of the interest rate factor. So it's really interesting to see how much of an impact this will have as a whole.
Let's talk about the Daily Telegraph business page, because Barclays, some of its former bosses, possibly breathing a sigh of relief. It's managed so far to avoid a trial over these claims that senior officials were knew about attempts to rig LIBOR. Now, the story basically goes on about how Barclays has now settled in a landmark LIBOR case with Guardian Care Homes, and it looks like people like Bob Diamond, former boss, won't have to now stand trial or give evidence in a trial.
No, they wouldn't, and Barclays might be, to some extent, breathing a sigh of relief. But the other interesting aspect of this is how far the LIBOR rigging scandal is actually interlinked with other types of issues in the financial services sector. Now, interestingly, this is a care home that has gone and borrowed money, and as part of that borrowing has entered into an interest rate swap agreement. And now part of its claim is that it's not liable to pay a certain amount of the debt because the initial reference rates, which were LIBOR, were actually rigged. So is this a get-out-of-jail-free card, potentially? Now, Barclays has to write down some level of that debt and pay out. But there's also a countersuit by Barclays against the care home. And I think it's interesting, but it just goes how far all the other issues we've seen over the last few years have actually come in the broader financial services.
It's a bit of a test case, isn't it, for this whole thing?
It is a bit of a test case, and I don't think we've seen the end of it yet.
Let's talk about zero-hours contracts. Now, we've spoken about them, and they're basically contracts where the employer isn't committed to giving the employee any number of hours specifically, so they're not guaranteed work. Why would we see RBS advising its clients to use these contracts? Because they've caused so much controversy in the UK.
Well, this RBS mentor service is not an entirely free service, right? So let's not forget that. The other point here is that it particularly affects the services, the retail sector and the social care sectors, which you'd argue perhaps in recent economic times have actually been particularly affected. So there's also a broader moral question here as to whether zero-hour contracts actually ethically there is a place for them ethically in society, given all the economic issues, the difficult economic times we've been seeing, particularly for workers at the bottom of the pyramid. So I think it is an issue with, obviously, the political parties will want to ride on and then see if they can reach
particularly since it's 80% owned by the taxpayer.
Absolutely, and really there is an issue of accountability here, which I guess the parties will be wading into.
Are you musical, Rolake?
I am. Certainly not a violinist, but a pianist. I do play
pianist. Okay.
Yeah.
So Stradivarius, I did play the violin,
Yeah.
was never good enough to even touch
Yeah.
a Stradivarius, let alone play one. But apparently, this lauded instrument isn't as wonderful.
It isn't as wonderful, apparently, and it's interesting because these tests have apparently been going on since 1817. And this is not the first one. I did some additional research on top of this. And these are for instruments that are, in some of the most recent auctions, have been worth almost $10 million.
Maybe it's more to do with the history of the instrument rather than how it sounds or feels, I guess, in a way.
But given that even some of the top virtuoso players can't exactly distinguish, it does open a lot of questions, perhaps, but still nonetheless quite a formidable piece of art. Yeah, certainly.
Rolake, it's always great having you with us. Thanks very much. Rolake Akinkugbe there from Ecobank. Mariam and I, see you soon.
Bye-bye.